Hi everyone. All right, so in this presentation we're going to go over some of the major themes of chapter 1. So this chapter is dedicated to the big ideas in biology, which is the scientific study of life, the process of science, that's something we're going to be talking about, and then some major themes in biology, like evolution. All right, so let's get started. So I will always start off each PowerPoint presentation with learning objectives, right? I always want you to know what the focus is and what the goal is. So for today, our learning objectives are first to recognize and describe the unifying characteristics of living things, to identify and describe the 3 domains of life, to summarize the hierarchical organization of living things, to list, define, and explain each step of the scientific process and apply the scientific method to research. We spent a lot of time in lab doing that. And then examine how evolution is life's unifying theme. Okay, so I'm highlighting the first one because that's what we are beginning with. So biology is the study of life. Let's think about what are some of the properties of life. If you were to describe a living organism, what are some of the properties that make up all living organisms? So if you were in my physical class, I would have you take out a piece of paper and brainstorm. So I'm going to have you pause now. List as many things you can think of that would be a property of life. Okay, so go ahead and pause and do that. Okay, are you back? So let's think, what are the properties of life? Well, your book outlines quite a few. So one property of living things is that there is order. So if you look at this picture of the plant, you can see how beautifully ordered it is. Living things, all living things are made up of cells, right? We'll talk a lot about cells in our next unit. And in these cells are DNA. So living things contain genetic information, right? Genetic information that stores and processes information. And so in some organisms this is DNA, and some it's only RNA, but if it is a living thing, it has to contain genetic information. Okay, let's look at the picture of the elephants. All living things survive, grow and reproduce, right? So in order to pass on our genes, we have to reproduce, right? And we grow. So here's a picture of an organism that is hatching out of a shell, and so it's representing growth and development. Okay. Maybe you listed that we as living things have to process energy in some way, right? So look at this caterpillar, it's eating some food and then it's transforming the energy in this food to energy that it can use. Okay, so organisms transform energy. All right. Organisms regulate themselves, right? They have regulatory mechanisms, and we have to maintain a beneficial internal environment. So different organisms do this in different ways, but we have some form of regulation of our internal environment. Okay, and then finally, organisms adapt and evolve. We'll talk a lot about the process of evolution, a little in this PowerPoint, and then later on in the semester. Okay, so how does that compare with your list? So when we think about what makes up living things, what are the properties of living things, these are the main ones. All right, so let's think about viruses. This is a kind of a special case study. Do you think that viruses are living things? I mean, think about the COVID virus. Is that a living thing? I'll tell you, viruses do not have cells. They are not cells. They actually have a protein coat. So they're not made up of cells. And I told you that one of the characteristics of living things is that living things either are a cell or they contain cells. So is a virus living? It does have organelles like mitochondria, ribosomes, and they have either DNA or RNA. Viruses need a host to reproduce. They can't copy their own genetic material. They insert their genetic material in hosts, and the host copies it for them. And so one of the properties of living things I told you was that organisms can survive and reproduce and grow and reproduce. And viruses can't reproduce on their own. So are they alive? What do you think? So I'm using this example to tell you that biology is not cut and dry. There's a lot of gray area, right? So some biologists argue that viruses are alive. Some say no. Given how we define life, they're not. So really it comes back to your definition of what is a living thing. So are viruses alive? Well, it depends on how you define living things. Okay, so we talked about the first learning objective. Let's move on to number 2. So our second learning objective is to identify and describe the 3 domains of life. So let's move on to that. Okay, let's look at life's diversity. We humans like to classify things, and the study of naming and classifying species is called taxonomy. Okay, so back when I was learning this, back when I was taking intro bio about 25 years ago, there were 5 kingdoms, and that's how we grouped organisms. Things are very different now. We have better genetic data. We have better genetic data all around that allows us to classify organisms in groups that they're most closely related to. Okay, let's start with 2 domains that I'm going to talk about very quickly. I'm not going to spend too much time on the archaea and the bacteria. If you take microbiology, you'll spend a whole semester on these guys. So domain bacteria, domain archaea, these are microscopic organisms that are generally single-celled organisms. Members of archaea often live in very extreme environments, very cold environments or warm environments. So domain bacteria, domain archaea. The third domain is eukarya. So these are eukaryotes. We fall into this category. Humans fall into this category. Don't make the mistake of thinking that eukaryotes are multi-celled organisms. Many of them are. Some of them are not. For example, protists. So there are multiple kingdoms of protists, and they are single-celled organisms, but they share similar characteristics to other eukaryotes, and so we group them in the domain eukarya. They are eukaryotes. Okay, so let's see. Let's talk about the other 3 kingdoms: kingdom Plantae, kingdom Fungi, kingdom Animalia. So some of these share some similar characteristics. People tend to think that fungi are actually plants. They're not. We separate these 3 kingdoms out by how organisms in these 3 kingdoms obtain nutrients. Okay, so let's look at our next slide. Okay, so I've just moved this picture up, but I'm telling you that these 3 kingdoms are classified by how they obtain their nutrition. We know that plants photosynthesize. They convert energy into the sun, from the sun, and they store that energy in chemical bonds, so they actually make their own food. Okay, we can't do this as animals. Fungi cannot do this. Fungi don't have chlorophyll, so they don't photosynthesize. All right, how do fungi obtain their food? So fungi decompose organic waste, and they absorb these nutrients directly into their cells. So they don't eat food, they don't photosynthesize, they break down organic waste, and they absorb these nutrients into their cells. Kingdom Animalia, that is the kingdom that we belong to. We are animals. You can see this butterfly nectaring on a flower. We, organisms in Kingdom Animalia, we eat other organisms. That's how we obtain our nutrition. So we either eat organisms in the Kingdom Plantae, so we eat plants, we eat fungi, we eat other animals, and that is how we obtain our nutrients. Okay, so we have covered number 1 and number 2 learning objectives. Let's move on to number 3. All right, so let's think about the hierarchical organization of life. We've talked about how we organize life from a taxonomic perspective, but let's zoom out and think about other ways that we can organize life. So your book breaks up this hierarchical organization into a number of different groupings. So let's start really big and zoom out. and talk about the biosphere. So the biosphere is all life and places where life exists. So land, bodies of water, the lower atmosphere of Earth, right? Biosphere, Earth is a sphere. Okay, so that's the biosphere. And then if we zoom in, the biosphere is made up of a number of different ecosystems. So ecosystem. So here we're looking at an ecosystem that is a mangrove ecosystem. So this includes all the organisms in it. So now I'm talking about the definition of an ecosystem. So the organisms in an area and all of the physical components that interact with all the life. And so you can think of like the soil, the water, the light, right? So it's these components and the life in that particular area. Okay, let's zoom in a little more and talk about what a community is. So a community is all the organisms in an ecosystem. So in this case here, we're looking at some mangroves. We know that there's grasses, we know there are many different plant species, we know there are some fish like these snappers, insects, snakes, alligators, all kinds of microorganisms here. So this is the community, right? All of the organisms. We're not talking about the physical properties anymore, like light or soil. That's ecosystem. We're talking about all of the organisms. Okay. Population. So what is a population? A population is a group of individuals of the same species that live in a community. For example, these snappers. So this would be a population of snappers. If we look at the mangroves, all of the individual mangroves, right? So that's one species, the mangrove. So that is a population of mangroves. Okay. We can zoom in even further and look at what makes up a population. Organisms. So here's one organism, and so that is just an individual living thing. Organisms are made up of organs and organ tissues. So here we're looking at the fish's nervous system. And so we can look at the brain and the spinal cord, right? So we're looking at its organs. And then here we can see tissues. So organs are made up of tissues. These are groups of similar cells performing similar functions. So we've got some neurons here that are sending information. And then we can break this down even further into cells. The cell is the functional unit of life. So we're going to spend a lot of time talking about the cell and what makes up a cell. And then if we look inside a cell, we can see organelles. Here is a nucleus. This is where our DNA is contained. Organelles are structures in a cell that are enclosed by a membrane. And then if we look at what makes up organelles, you can see that we have molecules. So molecules are chemical structures that are composed of one or more atoms. Okay, so we've zoomed all the way into the level of the molecule, and we started from ecosystem, right, and got closer and closer, smaller and smaller. And so we're looking at this hierarchical organization of life. So we've done number 1, 2, and 3. Let's go ahead and list, define, and explain each step of the scientific process. We spent a lot of time in lab. That was what your lab was about, so I'm not going to go over this in too much detail. This is just a reminder to review lab 1. Make sure you fill out all those questions. Make sure you understand everything. That gives you a very thorough review of the scientific process. I did show this nice little schematic in lab. Your book shows something a little bit different. My point was that science and the scientific method is not linear, it's circular. So you might start with an observation or a question, you move on to hypothesis, method, results. If you don't get something that works, you might start back up at your question or reframe your hypothesis, right? Many of you rejected your hypothesis in Monday's lab. And so that is a scientific process. It's not linear, it's circular. Okay, one very important caveat here is that correlation does not equal causation. I have a whole video that I posted that explains this, and so I'm not going to talk about this here, but that is a really important thing to remember whenever you're looking at a graph or reading the newspaper and hearing a headline that says that something is correlated. That doesn't mean that one thing causes the other. Okay, let's talk about what questions can science answer. Take a look at these questions, pause for a little bit, and answer the question, can science answer these questions? So pause and see what you think. Okay, so why do leaves change color? Can we answer that using the scientific method? Yes, we can design an experiment, we can come up with a hypothesis, we can reject our hypothesis, we can accept our hypothesis. We can answer this question using science. Why do squirrels hibernate in the winter? Yep, we can answer that. Where do waves in the ocean form? We can answer that. What is the best book? That's an opinion. We can't design an experiment to figure out what the best book is. We can look at people's opinions, but that's not necessarily science. That's an opinion. Why do crickets chirp? Yep, we can design an experiment to figure this out. Is there a God? Clearly that question is very different from the others. We cannot form a hypothesis and test this hypothesis. This is not science's job, is to answer this question. So science can't answer this question. Why do snakes shed their skin? Yeah, we can answer that. So whenever you're looking at scientific data, I want you to think about, okay, this is science. What are some questions that science can't answer, right? Science serves to answer questions that can be tested, right? And we talked about how the hypothesis has to be falsifiable, right? So that's science's role. Okay, so let's apply what we know about the scientific method using a case study. So I'm going to give you a few minutes to work on a particular question, and let's start by looking at a little bit of background. So there's this thing called Batesian mimicry. Some people call it Batesian mimicry. You can say it either way. And Batesian mimicry is a form of biological resemblance in which a noxious or dangerous organism, the model species, is equipped with a warning system like conspicuous coloration. And this organism is mimicked by a harmless organism. Okay, so here is a monarch butterfly on the right. Monarch butterflies, if you didn't know, are actually poisonous to birds and other predators. They eat milkweed, which contains toxins that are poisonous to many animals. And so when a bird comes across a monarch and has not had this experience before, it will eat a monarch or try to attempt to eat it. It will taste terrible. It is poisonous. It will spit it out, and it will not go for another monarch because it will know that, aha, if I look and see an organism that looks like this, that is toxic. I will poison myself. This viceroy here is not poisonous. The bird can eat this viceroy and be just fine and have a nice, nutritious meal. However, the viceroy mimics the monarch. It's called Batesian mimicry. Can you think about why this would be advantageous? If you look like a poisonous animal, are predators going to eat you? No. Okay. So the mimic gains protection because the predator mistakes it for the model. So the model in this case is the monarch, and it leaves it alone. So I'm going to have you pause the video and read this case scenario, this scenario. So I want you to look at this particular example that scientists were trying to figure out if it was Batesian mimicry or not. So pause, read this, and then come back when you're done. Okay, so you paused and you read that text. And now I want you to either I want you to grab a piece of paper, you can print this out, and jot down the following 11 things and try to answer them. So pause again, use that text to figure out what's the question, what's the hypothesis, what's the method, and so forth. This will take you some time. This will take you about 10 or 15 minutes, and if you were in my class, we would be sitting down doing this together. I do want you to go through this exercise. It's going to really help you. Okay, so maybe you got things right, maybe you didn't. The whole point was to go through this exercise and really work through that example to figure out what was the independent variable, what was the dependent variable, was the hypothesis supported, what was the hypothesis, what were their methods. Some of these questions were hard. This should have been maybe a little bit of a challenge for you. So check your answers with these answers and really think about what these answers mean. Think about what a graph of this data would look like, okay? So I want you to be able to take examples of the scientific method and be able to pick them apart and figure out what methods did they use, what was the control, what were the independent variables, what was their hypothesis. Okay. All right, so we're done with learning objective numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4. Let's tackle the last one here. Okay, so this is a picture of Charles Darwin, Charles Darwin proposed the theory of evolution by natural selection in 1859. So evolution, what is it? It is a change over time in the inherited characteristics of a population. So Darwin is obviously a very famous man. He spent many decades of his life working out the theory of evolution. So let's dive in. Okay, so lots of words on this slide here. So evolution is a change in time over the inherited characteristics of a population. I'm going to go over these quickly, but I do want you to pause and write this down, so take notes. Fitness is the ability of an organism to survive and reproduce. Adaptation. What's adaptation? It's a heritable trait that increases fitness. It increases an organism's fitness. Okay, so Darwin identified 4 key steps of natural selection. So your book has these as observations and inferences, same sort of thing. So we're talking about these as 4 key steps. Okay, so first he noticed that there is individual variation of individuals in a population. So say you're looking at a population of birds, one particular bird species, say a species of seagulls. Some of these seagulls are going to be a little bit lighter, some are going to be darker, some are going to have slightly longer beaks, some are going to have slightly shorter beaks. Okay, so there's variation among the individuals in a population. And these traits are heritable, right? Many of them are heritable. They're passed down from an organism to its offspring. Okay, the second thing that he noticed was there's often overproduction, right? So more offspring are produced than can survive to maturity, right? So an organism, especially insects, may have hundreds of offspring. Not all of them are going to live. Think about those baby turtles you see. When they hatch, they all go to the ocean. Many of them get picked off by predators, right? So in general, organisms are going to produce more offspring than can survive. So that's competition. Okay, and then Darwin made some inferences. So he said, okay, so there's unequal reproductive success. So we know that there is competition and overproduction of organisms, and that the individuals with traits that are better suited to their environment, that's really key here, better suited to the environment, because one trait might be advantageous in one environment and not advantageous in another environment. So those individuals with traits that are better suited to their environment are going to have higher fitness, and those individuals are going to survive and reproduce more than those that don't, right? They're going to have more offspring, and they're going to pass down their traits. And the fourth step is that the accumulation of these better traits, these more advantageous traits, are going to result in adaptation over time. So these individuals, there's going to be more individuals with these advantageous traits, right? And that results in evolution of a population. Okay, so as a result of 3, we know that as a result of step 3, we know that more individuals that have these adaptations are going to survive and reproduce. And so we should see these changes in the population. Okay. Let's look at a specific example. So here you can see I've noted the steps from the previous slide, step 1, step 2, and 3 here. It's shown in this one picture, and then step 4. So here you can see that there is a population of beetles with varied traits. That was step 1. Some are lighter, some are darker. You can imagine in this particular environment, maybe there was a fire, and so the ground is very dark, right? And so which beetles are going to be better at surviving? Well, the darker ones. So here you can see a bird is picking off the lighter ones because they're more obvious to the bird, right? And so you're going to have too many individuals, right? That was number 2 that can survive. So there's going to be competition, and those individuals with the traits that are more advantageous for that particular environment, right? Here it's the darker individuals are going to be the ones that survive and reproduce. Now we can imagine another scenario where the background is lighter, and then the bird would be eating the darker organisms in this population. We get a very different result, right? So it all depends on the environment. What traits are more advantageous for a particular environment? Okay, step 4. What we see in step 4 is we see that there's this increased frequency of traits that enhance survival and reproductive success, right? And this is evolution by natural selection. So as a result of natural selection, the frequency of the dark colored beetles in this population increased. those organisms were better suited to their environment. And so they were the ones that survived and reproduced, right? That resulted from just variation in the population. And those organisms that were better suited to the environment survived and reproduced. So we've made it through all 5 of our learning objectives. Now I want you to go ahead and watch the video of that correlation does not equal causation. And that should do it for chapter 1.